Chapter 5. The more I learn, the less I know. 11 a.m. Saturday 15th of August 1970. Hôtel Marquis, Rue Grenata, Paris. The Major is a dangerous lunatic, but he's right. How can I call myself Liana's best friend and then just sit here crying when she needs me to be strong for her? I get out my hanky and wipe my eyes, and then I pour us both another cup of tea. Perhaps it will help me to think. I begin thinking out loud. Someone killed Charlie Stout. Unless there's a serial killer on the loose, the killer wanted to put Stout out of action. Now that might be because he got into a dispute with some local hard man, but let's face it, he didn't have much time to get into a new fight. He'd only been here a couple of hours when he was killed. The Major has the dossier open, and so I appeal to him for corroboration. Is that right? He nods. Within the time frame, yes. By medical guesstimate he was killed within 1.5 to 3 hours of his arrival, and by reference to his known movements probably closer to an hour and a half. I need to find out where Liana had actually been during the time frame. She couldn't really have vanished and therefore she must have been somewhere. I go on thinking aloud. So it's unlikely that this was a new quarrel. The killer probably followed him here. But there are a lot of places the killer could have followed him from, and our Charlie is not a man who is well liked. The killer might even have been living here in Paris and just happened to see Charlie in the street. Or if the killer followed him, then the following could have been done in a lot of different ways. The Major frowns. I don't see that, my dear. Might have spotted him in the street, yes. Bit of a coincidence, but it could happen. Known it to happen, in fact, with another man. But never mind that. The point is, if he was followed, he could only have been followed on the train. True, but he could have been followed on the train in a lot of different ways. I begin ticking off some ways on my fingers. Index finger. 1. The killer might have known that he was coming on this tour, and come ahead of him, and been waiting for him in the tour hotel or at Gare du Nord. I interrupt my finger ticking for a moment to drink more tea. It really is scrumptious tea. After a moment of savoring my tea, I put down the cup and begin finger ticking again. Middle finger. 2. Or the killer might have had a partner on the train, a traveler or a railway employee, who sent a telegram, or something, saying that Stout was on the train. Ring finger. 3. Or the killer might have been a traveler or a railway employee on the train. Pinky. 4. Or it could be that the killer spotted Stout on the train by coincidence, and followed him after that. So the killer could have been on the train, or at the station, or at the hotel, or chance met in the street, or even chance met at the Eiffel Tower. That's a lot of possible killers. My head is exploding, so I stop for another sip of tea. The Major has pulled out a little leather notebook. He turns his notebook around so that I can see it. He has drawn columns across the pages. They are headed. These people were on the train. Tour guide was the last to see Stout alive. At the tower. Others saw Stout at the station, in the street, at the hotel. So they say. All in the dossier. What about Sänger? She was on the train. Short-sighted. Broke her spectacles. Couldn't recognize her friend without 'em, never mind Stout. So she says. Friend agrees. I sip some more tea. Well, we have to start somewhere. Let's talk to these people. And I'd like to draw up a list of who was where, when, because when I have to wade through all these different statements in the dossier, then I think it gets a bit confusing. And after that, Ellis, if I may, I'm going to take Liana some of your wonderful tea. The Major summons the gliding waiters again. While they are making fresh tea, the Major makes me a gift of a small leather-covered notebook, a bit like his, except the cover on mine is a pale tan, almost like the dull yellow thread in the Maguire plaid. People talk a lot about a Maguire tartan, but traditionally there is only the plaid. It's the Scots who have tartans as well as plaids. Liana's clan has 3. The Major and I do a lot of scribbling down of places and times onto some sheets of hotel notepaper, and then I carefully copy the results we have worked out into my new notebook. I also copy over onto a fresh page in my lovely notebook the columns of where people had seen Mr. Stout that the Major had written out. Working all that out takes a while to do, and by the time I finish the waiters have made a fresh pot of tea and decanted it into a vacuum flask. But I'm not ready to leave just yet. I'm too nosy not to ask how come the Major was at the British Embassy all of last night. Oh, just a spot of dinner, my dear. School chum of mine is the naval attaché there, always try to catch up with him when I'm in Paris. Bit of a knees up last night. That's why I was in dress uniform. I'm in the reserves, you know. I'm not fooled. If 25 bright eager teenagers, all of them backing each other up, can't pull the wool over my eyes, it's not likely that one frail old man can. The Major is up to something. But I must go and see Liana, so whatever he's hiding will just have to stay hidden for now. I'll get the story out of him later. We agree to meet up again at 4 o'clock, at Hotel Albert. The Major says we can try to find some of the people on our lists then, and ask them to talk to us. Somehow I feel sure that there won't be any try about it. The Major will see to it, in some hidden way, that anyone he wants to talk to just happens to be there when he arrives. But why does he care about freeing my friend? I pick up the flask of tea and some of the little cakes too, and go to see Liana. But the gendarmes won't let me see Liana with the tea flask, or let her have the tea and cakes. So I ask for Inspector Toussaint. They put me in a waiting room. The inspector comes there quite soon. He explains that the wee flask of tea is forbidden because forbidden substances could be dissolved in the tea, and there is a similar objection to the cakes. Me and Liana aren't into the psychedelic scene, Inspector, honestly. But in Paris you can't get the kind of tea British people drink, and so Major Peveril has it specially made for him. He kindly sent his tea to Liana to cheer her up. Tea isn't on the forbidden list you gave me. And Inspector, you said she might be here for a year. You surely won't deny her a mouthful of tea in all that time. I thought that it might put some heart into her. I've pulled out all the stops. Now we'll see just how much weight Major Peveril carries around here. The inspector takes the flask from me. He shakes his head. Ah, Miss Maguire, you beautiful British ladies, you must learn to live without your tea. Take coffee, it is a much better drink. He sends for coffee, and then for Liana. A tray arrives with a full coffee pot, cups and saucers, milk and sugar. Then Liana is brought in. The inspector pours out coffee for me and for himself, but into Liana's cup he pours tea out of the flask. He really is a very kind man. Inspector Toussaint explains to Liana about the dossier, and Liana having a good head on her, she understands at once. Then he says we may have half an hour to talk alone, and after that Liana can make a list for me of things she wants me to bring her, and then he will look over the list and tell me what I'm allowed to bring. It all sounds pretty good to me. I can see how lucky we are that the Major has been able to persuade Inspector Toussaint to interest himself in Liana's case. He leaves us alone. The phone is ringing as Tristan Toussaint comes into his office. Oui. An English voice on the other end. They've just left London. Have you men at the airport? But of a certainty, my dear confrère, I always have men at the airport. Never mind that. I meant, do you have some men at Orly on the lookout for this lot? Of course. How could it be otherwise, when it is Scotland Yard who asks this favour of us? At last I can give Liana a big hug. And we cry into each other's shoulders for a little while, but I mustn't waste this time when we can talk, and so after a bit I push her back into her seat. Liana, we have to get you out of here. The police are convinced that you killed Charlie Stout. Where were you for all that time last night? What were you really doing? She's embarrassed. I fell asleep. I was tired and you told me to go sit down and I did, and then I fell asleep. I can see that she's leaving something out. I need to know what. Yes, but where? You weren't in the lobby, you weren't in the room. Anyway, you didn't have the room key. Oh, she's embarrassed all right. She thinks I'm going to say that she shouldn't have done whatever it was she did. But the stakes are too high for me to start moralizing, doesn't she know that? Maybe not, Her face is turned away from me. So I stroke her arm soothingly. Liana, love, you were tired, you wanted to sit down, isn't that right? She nods. And you couldn't find a seat in the lobby, and anyway it was noisy. She nods. And you didn't go into the bar, not at first, because you had only been there a minute when we found you. She nods. So where did you go first, love? It was like pulling teeth, but I got out of her where she had been.